They thought the American jets were just another roar in the distant sky, until the ground around them erupted in fire. Vietnamese soldiers called it the Ghost Strike. 1 second, the jungle was silent. The next, everything vanished in smoke and thunder. The F-4 Phantom appeared out of nowhere, its scream slicing through the clouds like a blade. It struck so fast that by the time soldiers raised their rifles, the jets were already gone, leaving only craters and echoes in the air. They couldn't understand how something that loud could disappear so completely, how death could arrive unseen and then melt into the horizon. To those who fought beneath that sky, the Phantom wasn't just an aircraft. It was a nightmare made of speed, power, and shadows. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the early days of the Vietnam War. By the mid-1960s, the skies over Vietnam had become a stage for a new kind of war, one where speed, altitude, and radar meant the difference between life and death. The United States had entered Vietnam believing that air power alone could bend the will of an entire nation. They had the most advanced aircraft on Earth, and among them stood one machine that symbolized American dominance, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. Originally designed for the U.S. Navy as a fleet defense interceptor, the Phantom was never meant for the kind of jungle war waiting in Southeast Asia. It was a heavy, twin-engined monster that could fly faster than Mach 2, climb higher than any Soviet fighter, and carry more weapons than a World War II bomber. Its size and raw power turned it into both a guardian and a terror, a jet that could defend aircraft carriers or flatten entire sections of forest in a single run. When it entered Vietnam, it was the most expensive, complex, and intimidating aircraft the world had ever seen. For American commanders, the Phantom represented certainty, a machine that proved their technological edge was unbreakable. The U.S. believed that controlling the skies meant controlling the war. Their logic was simple. If no enemy could move or fight without being seen, the ground war would soon collapse. B-52s would pound the jungles from above, and the Phantoms would clean up whatever remained. Fast, precise, unstoppable. But the reality waiting over North Vietnam was far different. The terrain was a labyrinth of mountains, rivers, and thick forests that swallowed radar signals. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong had learned to vanish into the green, using the land itself as armor. Every trail was hidden, every anti-aircraft gun camouflaged. American pilots flying at hundreds of miles per hour often saw nothing until the sky lit up with tracer fire. The Phantom's speed, once seen as its greatest advantage, became a double-edged sword. It was too fast for pilots to spot ground targets clearly, too loud to approach unnoticed, and too complex for the humid, unpredictable conditions of Vietnam. Its advanced radar systems often failed in the heavy moisture of monsoon clouds, and the jungle below offered few landmarks to navigate by. Still, its raw power made it a weapon no one could ignore. Vietnamese troops who had spent years fighting with limited anti-air weapons quickly learned to fear and study this new predator. From far below, they would hear a faint roar, a sound growing until it shook the ground. In a blur, bombs would fall and the jets would vanish before anyone could fire back. To those on the ground, the Phantom seemed supernatural, like thunder controlled by human hands. At the same time, Soviet advisors rushed to supply North Vietnam with radar-guided SAM missiles and MiG-21 interceptors, creating one of the most dangerous air defense networks on Earth. The sky became a chessboard of blips and beeps where every second counted. American pilots flying Phantoms were suddenly not just hunters, but also hunted. By 1966, air superiority over Vietnam was no longer guaranteed. Every mission was a gamble. Phantom squadrons based in Thailand, Da Nang, and on carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin launched daily strikes, knowing they might never return. Yet, despite the risk, the Phantom's legend only grew. Its sheer power, its speed, and the eerie way it could appear, strike, and vanish made it a symbol of American might, and to those beneath it, a symbol of terror. That combination of awe and fear would define the next phase of the war. The Phantom wasn't just another jet. It was a statement, a promise that America could dominate any battlefield from the skies. But in the jungles of Vietnam, even the fastest machines would learn a harsh lesson. Speed means nothing when the enemy refuses to be seen.
When the first F-4 Phantoms arrived in Vietnam, they represented the peak of American engineering, a machine born not from necessity, but from ambition. The United States wanted a fighter that could do everything: dogfight, bomb, intercept, and intimidate. What they created was a brute force masterpiece. Twin J-79 engines that could push it to over 1,400 miles per hour. An airframe so strong it could dive faster than any aircraft before it, and a payload so massive that it could carry nuclear weapons, missiles, and bombs all at once. It was the ultimate do-it-all jet, and Vietnam would become its proving ground. The Phantom wasn't built around elegance. It was built around speed and power. It could outclimb and outrun nearly anything in the sky. But it came with trade-offs. It was heavy, it was loud, and it left behind twin black trails that could be seen for miles. The Air Force and Navy pilots who flew it learned quickly that its speed was both its greatest weapon and its greatest weakness. It allowed lightning-fast attacks, but it also made the jet difficult to handle in close combat and nearly impossible to hide. When it entered the skies over North Vietnam, the Phantom was a shock to both sides. To American forces, it was the pride of their arsenal, a sleek symbol of industrial supremacy. To the Vietnamese below, it was a beast that came screaming from the clouds, dropping fire, then vanishing into the horizon. The ground trembled when Phantom struck. The noise was so intense that soldiers described it as the sound of the sky tearing open. Yet the Phantom faced problems from the very start. Its designers, in their obsession with missiles and radar, had omitted one key feature: a gun. The belief at the Pentagon was that aerial dogfighting was obsolete, that future air battles would be fought at long range with guided missiles. In theory, the Phantom didn't need to get close to its enemies. In practice, Vietnam proved them wrong. When MiG-17s and MiG-21s, smaller, more agile Soviet-built jets, began to engage American Phantoms at close range, the flaws became deadly obvious. The missiles often failed to lock on in humid, cluttered airspace. Dogfights quickly devolved into chaotic turn battles where the Phantom's size and sluggish maneuverability put it at a disadvantage. Pilots found themselves in knife fights carrying only spears. To survive, they adapted. They learned to use the Phantom's raw speed and climb rate to their advantage, hit fast, fire, and escape. Boom and zoom, they called it. A Phantom that tried to turn with a MiG was a dead Phantom. but one that struck from above and disappeared could not be touched. American pilots learned to dive out of the sun, attack before radar could warn the enemy, and vanish back into the clouds. The jet became a ghost of its name, seen only for seconds before it was gone. By 1967, the Phantom had become the backbone of U.S. air power in Vietnam. Hundreds of them flew daily, bombing bridges, escorting B-52s, providing close air support for ground troops pinned down in the jungle. Squadron names like Wolfpack, Gunfighters, and Black Knights became legends. Each pilot decorated their aircraft with kill markings and shark mouths, turning their jets into flying icons of American aggression. Still, every mission carried the shadow of the North Vietnamese Air Defense Network, one of the most sophisticated outside the Soviet Union. Radar-guided SAM-2 missiles waited in the hills, and every valley bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Phantoms had to fly low, fast, and unpredictable to survive. It became a deadly dance of timing and instinct. A second too high, and radar would see you. A second too low, and you might clip the treetops or crash into a mountain hidden by cloud. To improve their odds, the U.S. began modifying Phantoms with new countermeasures: chaff dispensers, radar jammers, and warning receivers that screamed when a missile locked on. Pilots learned to drop flares and perform high-speed rolls to throw off heat-seeking missiles.
But every new adaptation was met with a counter. Vietnamese forces, guided by Soviet radar, learned to time their launches perfectly, firing in volleys to overwhelm the jet's defenses. At bases like Da Nang and U Dorn, pilots prepared for missions with the understanding that survival was never guaranteed. They memorized terrain maps, enemy radar zones, and escape routes. Some painted small skulls under the cockpit, each one representing a mission where they came back alive. The Phantom was no longer just a tool of war. It was a lifeline, a fragile shell separating them from the chaos below. Despite the constant threat, the Phantom's reputation only grew. It proved it could take damage and still bring its crew home. Pilots returned with holes torn through their wings, engines on fire, canopies cracked by shrapnel, and yet the jet flew. Its twin engines gave it resilience few aircraft could match. A MiG could outturn it, but rarely outlast it. The Phantom earned a brutal nickname among its pilots, the Rhino, because it was powerful, clumsy, but nearly indestructible. For the Vietnamese troops, the Phantom became a symbol of something far more psychological. They learned to read the sounds of the sky, the difference between a slow B-52 bomber and the sharp, thunderous scream of an F-4. Many would dive into tunnels or trenches the moment they heard that piercing roar, knowing that within seconds the ground would erupt. To them, the Phantom wasn't just a plane, it was an omen. The development of tactics on both sides became a constant evolution. The Americans refined their strike formations. 2 Phantoms would lure out MiGs, while another pair waited high above to ambush. The Vietnamese adapted too, using decoy radar signals and false SAM sites to draw the jets into traps. The war over Vietnam's skies became as much a battle of wits as of weapons. As the years went on, upgraded versions of the Phantom appeared, F-4D, F-4E, each more advanced, each pushing the limits of technology. The later models added internal cannons, improved radar, and laser-guided bombs. By the early 1970s, the Phantom could hit a bridge from 20,000 feet with deadly precision. It was no longer just a blunt weapon, it had evolved into a scalpel of destruction. But no matter how advanced it became, the core truth of the Vietnam War remained unchanged. Technology alone could not guarantee victory. The Phantom's speed and power could devastate, but it couldn't hold territory, it couldn't see through the jungle, and it couldn't stop an enemy that refused to fight on its terms. Still,
The Phantom's legacy was written in the thunder it left behind. It proved that the skies belonged to no one, not even the mightiest machine. For every phantom that struck and vanished, the war below continued, untouched by speed or firepower. The jet that symbolized American dominance would soon become a lesson in humility, that in Vietnam, even the fastest shadows could not outrun the ground war that never ended.
The morning sun had barely pierced the mist over North Vietnam when the radar screens aboard the carrier USS Coral Sea lit up with movement. Dozens of blips, SAM sites, MiGs, unknowns, flickered like ghosts across the green scope. It was 1967, and Operation Rolling Thunder was in full swing. The target, a bridge near Hanoi that had survived weeks of bombing. The weapon, a squadron of F-4 Phantoms armed to the teeth. The pilots climbed into their cockpits, sweat already forming under their helmets despite the cool dawn air. Below deck, the carrier's engines thundered, catapults armed and ready. As the first Phantom roared down the deck, its twin J-79 engines shrieked like steel demons, the sound vibrating through every rib of the ship. Within seconds, it was airborne, slicing into the sky, climbing toward the jungle-covered mountains that hid their prey. To the Vietnamese soldiers stationed near the bridge, it began like any other morning, the distant hum of aircraft, the uneasy quiet before impact. But that day would not be like the others. The Phantoms came in low, hugging the terrain, invisible to radar until it was too late. Their approach was timed to the second. In the span of minutes, the tranquil valley transformed into a storm of fire. "Phantom flight rolling in hot," crackled the radio. Bomb bay doors opened. The jungle below shimmered with heat as napalm canisters pummeled downward, trailing orange flames. The explosions rolled across the landscape like thunderclaps, turning trees into torches. Vietnamese anti-aircraft crews scrambled, their guns firing blindly into the clouds. But the jets were too fast. By the time the tracers reached their altitude, the Phantoms were already miles away. One pilot later recalled, "It wasn't like flying, it was like being shot out of a cannon, straight into hell." The Phantoms turned sharply, diving again. Their afterburners flared blue as Sidewinder missiles screened from their pylons toward the intercepting MiGs. A split second later, the sky erupted in flashes. Pieces of burning metal spiraled downward through the haze. The battle for the air had begun, and no one on either side could see more than a blur. From the ground, Vietnamese troops described it as chaos made flesh. The Phantoms appeared for seconds, silver streaks cutting through the clouds, then vanished into the sky. The roar arrived after the destruction. One soldier wrote later in his diary, "We never saw them coming. The sky opened, the earth burned, and then it was silent again." Inside one Phantom, Captain John Blackjack Thomas gripped the stick tightly. Warning lights flashed red. Radar lock. A Soviet-built SAM missile had found them. He shouted into the radio, "Missile, 9 o'clock!" The backseater, his radar intercept officer, slammed the flare release. Bright magnesium streaks burst behind them as the missile closed in, hissing through the air like a spear of smoke. "Hold on!" Thomas rolled right hard, diving toward the jungle canopy at nearly 600 knots. The missile exploded behind them, the shockwave rocking the jet violently. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. For a moment, the cockpit filled with smoke, alarm screaming. But the engines held. The Phantom climbed again, bruised but alive. Another squadron, call sign Wolfpack, entered from the east, their mission to finish what the first wave had started. They dropped their payload in perfect formation, 750-pound bombs that shattered the bridge's central span in a single strike. The structure that had defied the U.S. Air Force for months finally collapsed into the river below. From the cockpit, the pilot saw nothing but dust and fire, but they knew they had hit their mark. The Vietnamese anti-aircraft gunners didn't give up.
Dozens of 37mm cannons unleashed a storm of tracer rounds. The sky looked alive, lines of fire crisscrossing the air like red veins. One Phantom took a direct hit to the wing. The pilot ejected seconds before the jet spiraled into the ground, a flaming comet that disappeared into the trees. As American rescue choppers scrambled, another wave of Phantoms dove in to suppress enemy fire. Their machine guns raked the hillsides, their rockets exploding in chains. The smell of burning fuel and soil filled the air.
On the ground, Vietnamese soldiers dragged wounded comrades through the smoke, shouting orders that were drowned out by the thunder of engines. In the chaos, a lone MiG-21 appeared, silver, sleek and deadly. It darted between the clouds, hunting. Its radar locked on to a Phantom still loaded with bombs. The MiG fired. The missile streaked forward, cutting through the air like lightning. But the Phantom pilot saw the plume. He pulled a high G turn, flares bursting from his tail. The missile missed, exploding harmlessly in the distance. Before the MiG could recover, another Phantom appeared from above, diving straight at it. "Fox 2!" A Sidewinder missile leapt off the rail. The MiG pilot tried to roll away, but there was no time. The missile struck dead center. A burst of fire, a blossom of smoke, and then nothing. The radio crackled with adrenaline. "Splash 1 Bandit!" But victory was fleeting. The radar screened again. Another SAM launch. The pilots could almost feel the enemy's eyes on them, hidden in the jungle. The ground itself seemed alive with danger. Flares burst, chaff clouds scattered, and the Phantoms broke formation, each jet diving for safety in its own desperate maneuver. For 5 minutes, the sky became pure chaos. Contrails twisting, missiles streaking, explosions echoing across valleys. Pilots described it as fighting inside a thunderstorm made of metal. No one could see the enemy clearly, only flashes of silver and bursts of flame. It was the essence of modern war, fast, mechanical, and terrifyingly impersonal. Down below, the Vietnamese regrouped, firing everything they had. The roar of anti-aircraft guns mixed with the shriek of rockets. Every time the Phantoms vanished, soldiers would run for cover, expecting them to return from a different direction. And they always did. The Americans used the speed of their jets to create illusions, striking from one angle, disappearing, then reappearing behind the enemy. By the end of the battle, the air smelled of cordite and rain. Smoke rose from the valley like fog, covering craters the size of houses. The bridge was gone, the hills scarred black. But for every American plane that returned, another failed to report in. At the debrief that night, pilots sat in silence. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, their hands trembling. They spoke quietly of friends who hadn't made it back, of missiles that came too close, of the moments where the world seemed to slow to a heartbeat. You never see it coming. You just feel the light hit you, and then it's gone. For the men on the ground, it was a day they would never forget. They had seen the Phantom's fury and survived. To them, it was proof that even the mightiest weapon could bleed. In later interviews, Vietnamese veterans would recall how they learned to listen for the faint echo that followed each attack, the only warning before the next strike. As dusk fell over the jungle, the sounds of war faded into a heavy silence. The Phantoms returned to their carriers, battered and fuel-starved, landing one by one under the red glow of the deck lights. The flight crews rushed to meet them, counting each tail number with anxious eyes. When the last jet touched down, cheers erupted, a momentary relief in a war that offered few. But above that dark ocean, the truth was clear. The Phantom had lived up to its name. It struck fast, vanished faster, and left nothing behind but the haunting echo of its engines. To the Americans, it was a symbol of technological power. To the Vietnamese, it was a reminder that even in the sky, no one was untouchable. And as the smoke cleared over the shattered bridge, both sides understood something they hadn't before. The Phantom was not just a weapon of speed and fire. It was the embodiment of the war itself. a ghost that haunted the living, appearing without warning, leaving silence in its wake. That day, the F-4 Phantom earned its legend and its curse.
When the smoke finally cleared over the shattered valleys of North Vietnam, the silence was almost unbearable. The Phantom squadrons had returned to their bases, their wings scorched, fuselages riddled with bullet holes. On the ground, the devastation stretched for miles. Burned forests, twisted bridges, and craters large enough to swallow trucks. For both sides, the battle had ended, but the war in the sky was far from over. In the aftermath of those brutal encounters, the Phantom became more than just a machine. It became a symbol of everything the Vietnam War represented: overwhelming power, human ingenuity, and the futility of control. The Americans celebrated its victories with pride. Headlines back home called it the war's workhorse, the jet that carried the burden of rolling thunder and linebacker. But among the pilots who flew it, there was little celebration. They knew the truth behind the statistics. Every mission meant friends lost, aircraft gone, and the haunting knowledge that no amount of firepower could break the will of the enemy below. For the Vietnamese, the Phantom's shadow was burned into memory. Villagers learned to recognize its distinct roar long before they could see it. Children dove into bunkers when the sky began to tremble. Anti-aircraft crews became obsessed with studying its patterns, timing its passes, predicting the seconds between attack and silence. Each successful shoot-down was celebrated not just as a military victory, but as proof that human determination could defeat the impossible. The psychological impact was immense. To American ground troops, the Phantom's arrival was often a sign of salvation, a wall of noise and flame that could push back an ambush or clear an enemy position. But to the soldiers beneath its bombs, it was pure terror. Survivors spoke of the earth itself trembling, of the sound echoing in their bones long after the jets had vanished. The Phantom did not just destroy, it haunted. In time, its limitations became impossible to ignore. It could obliterate a target in seconds, but it couldn't hold territory. It could strike faster than any plane before it, but it couldn't find an enemy hidden beneath the trees. Its very strength, speed, altitude, and distance separated it from the war it was meant to win. The jungle war belonged to those who could vanish, not those who could fly. American engineers continued to refine the Phantom, adding radar gun sights, better navigation systems, and even internal cannons to fix the mistakes of its design. Yet the truth was clear. The Phantom's brilliance had come too late to change the war's outcome. For every bridge destroyed, another was rebuilt. For every enemy camp bombed, another appeared deeper in the jungle. The jet that once promised quick victory became part of a grinding stalemate that no technology could escape. When the war finally ended, the Phantom's roar faded from Southeast Asia. Many of its airframes were shipped home or sent to other allies. Some were displayed in museums, polished and silent, monuments to an era when men believed machines could conquer anything. But the pilots never forgot. They spoke of the smell of jet fuel, the weight of silence after landing, and the uneasy feeling that followed them long after the war, that they had fought shadows with lightning and still couldn't change the ground below. For the Vietnamese, the memory was different. They had faced an enemy that ruled the skies and survived. The Phantom's speed had terrified them, but it had also taught them resilience, how to adapt,
to listen, to disappear before the next strike. It became part of their mythology, the sound of thunder that could not win a war. In the years that followed, military historians would call the Phantom one of the most successful fighters ever built. It broke records, won dogfights, and served for decades. But Vietnam gave it something no number could measure. A legend forged in both triumph and tragedy. It showed that no matter how fast or powerful a machine becomes, war will always come down to the people who fight it and the land that refuses to surrender. For America, it was a lesson written in smoke and blood. Technology can dominate the sky, but not the human spirit below it. The Phantom struck fast and vanished, but its echo, the echo of that ghostly roar, still lingers in the memories of those who saw it sweep across the Vietnamese sky and disappear into the clouds, leaving only silence and a war that refused to end.
In the end, the Phantom was more than just a jet. It was a ghost that defined a generation of war. Its thunderous arrival, its blinding strikes, and its sudden disappearance became the rhythm of a conflict that no one fully understood. It symbolized both America's greatest power and its deepest frustration, a reminder that speed and strength could win battles, but not hearts, not ground, not peace. For those who lived through it, the sound of the Phantom still echoes somewhere deep in memory. The scream of the engines, the rush of the wind, the trembling earth. It was the sound of dominance, but also of distance. High above the treetops, men fought battles they could not see, while below, soldiers and villagers endured a war that refused to fade. Even today, decades later, when veterans hear that familiar roar at an air show, they pause. Some look up in awe, others close their eyes, because they remember what followed: the flash, the fire, the vanishing silhouette that left only silence behind. The F-4 Phantom didn't just strike and vanish. It became the spirit of a war that moved too fast to comprehend, a ghost that still haunts the skies of history. Next time, we'll descend from the clouds, into the mud, the tunnels, and the invisible war that waited beneath the earth.